Chilling secrets from the gas station. Internet's scariest tales. I kept a journal on receipt paper. Not because I thought receipts were dramatic. There's nothing dramatic about taped chewing gum or the dates in the corner. But because that's what was always in my pocket. The printer at the register spat them out in thin, curling strips. When the lights were bleak and my hands were shaking, I tore off what I'd just rung up and wrote on the back. Most of these pages are greasy with coffee, smeared with the dust from the bag of dog food we sold on the regular, and some of them have the faint paw print of a raccoon that thought my jeans were a good place to sleep. But there they are. They are mine. And they are, when stitched together, an inventory of strange things. If the town has a heart, ours is held together with duct tape, cheap coffee, and the humming fluorescent light of a 24-hour gas station on the edge of town. It sits where the last of the street lamps peter out, and the road remembers how to go nowhere. People call it the last stop. Kids call it spooky. The locals sell it as folklore, a toothache in a building. To me, it's a thin place where the ordinary slips and someone else's habits peek through. 3:17 a.m. The smell again. Sweet, like honeysuckle someone left in the pocket of rotted laundry. Clara calls it the honeysuckle ammonia and pretends not to gag. It collects in the morning coffee and settles into the vinyl seats of the stool by the register. It makes your mouth water in a wrong way. I can smell it now as I write this, and I only closed my eyes for a second. I should introduce myself before the stories get ahead of me. My name is Jack. I worked the overnight shift at the pump and convenience that locals call Miller's at the edge of nowhere for 3 years. I was there for the bleach spills and the kids who would sleep on the cardboard behind the racks, for the regular that paid in questionable lottery tickets, and for the guy in a trench coat who would stand outside in the rain and never buy anything. I was there when the raccoons learned how to catcall at midnight. I was there when a man named Kefir stopped coming in, and I was there when things began to multiply. These are not news reports. They're receipts, fragments, and the things I didn't want to remember and couldn't stop writing down. If you listen to the internet, it will tell you ghosts are a thing. If you work nights, you know the dead have a habit of filling silence. If you stay until dawn long enough in this town, you learn that places can take things from you, time, appetite, small, pocket-sized pieces of yourself, and return them changed. If you like deep dive horror from the internet, hit subscribe. More gas station tales coming. 11:46 p.m. The frozen drink machine hums like a low, patient beast. When it's quiet, the hum fills the room and seems to arrange itself around the fluorescent flicker above the slushy. It is always slightly out of tune, an off-key long note that matches the toothache I get right behind the molars whenever someone new comes in. Don't ask me why. It happens. You feel the sound in your jaw and you think about leaving early, but the bills don't care about hypersensitive molars. Rocco appears around 12:10 a.m. on most nights. He is not simply a raccoon. There's no polite way to say this. Rocco is a raccoon with the cheek of a street king, and a mutation in his eyes that makes him look like he remembers a better era. He leads a small, shifting band of raccoons. Smaller, smarter, meaner. They come for the trash and occasionally for the bag of onion-dusted fries a trucker loses in the lot. Rocco tilts his head at the smell, at the light, as if he is gauging whether the place is still worth prowling. When the gnomes started, everyone said someone was messing with us. A week of lawn ornaments lining the curb, silent and jaunty, staring with painted smiles at the road. At first it was funny. Then more appeared, tucked under car wipers, peeking between gas pumps, sitting on the hood of a dented pickup like they owned the vehicle. Gnomes appeared in groups of 3 at first, then in fields, then nests. They multiplied with a cheerfulness that felt wrong, like Santa's rejects reproducing overnight. 11:59 p.m. Customer, the bathroom cowboy. He walks in smelling faintly of saddle soap and old coins. He never spends more than 5 minutes. He comes in, uses the bathroom, stares at the mirror, and leaves a tip jar untouched. Sometimes he hums. Once he left a quarter and a note that said, "Keep your head on straight." The handwriting was neat and looped like horseshoes. He never talked. He never bought coffee. He never asked for change. When someone asked him why he was here one night, he tipped his hat and said, "If you don't know, you're lucky." I still don't know, and I'm not sure I call that luck. 3:02 a.m. The smell is worse tonight. Carlos says it smells like a yard of rotting fruit marinated in gasoline. Carlos has a laugh that looks like it hurt him when it happened. He works the morning shift sometimes, and the nights when he's avoiding things. He has a past that smells like cigarettes and halfway regret. He did time for something he won't explain. People think jail reforms you. Carlos says it taught him how to be quiet. He brought me an extra pack of cigarettes once, as if offering contraband was the same as offering trust. He told me in the car, with the heater making our breath small, that he'd hit something on Highway 7. He didn't mean a raccoon. He meant a body. Kefir is the name we called him before anyone knew his full name. He had a limp and a shopping cart, and he sat on the curb behind the hardware store sometimes, feeding the pigeons cracker crumbs in a manner that suggested he was trying to teach them an old language. He bought banana-flavored candy that he folded into wax paper and guarded like a relic. He told stories about a garden he once had and how he'd buried something there to keep it warm. He smelled like rosemary and old milk. The last time I saw Kefir, he was leaning into his shopping cart as if it were a confessional booth. 3:27 a.m. Carlos said he hit him, said he didn't see the man until it was too late, said he thought it was a deer. Carlos smelled like oil and fear when he told me. His hands wouldn't stop being too quick. We did what people do when they're desperate and ashamed. We moved a body out of sight and into a cooler behind the dry goods. We wrapped it in plastic, which felt both practical and obscene. I remember the way Kefir's breath fogged the inside of the cooler like a small, cheap fog machine, and the way his fingers curled in a way that did not look like sleeping. I didn't want to be complicit, and yet small-town calculus thrives on the exchange of secrets. We rationalized like professionals. Nobody will notice. He was a drifter. I wrote it down because I hoped writing would absolve me. It did not. There are entries where the ink jumps and splatters and parts of the paper are damp. Sometimes the receipt cuts off mid-sentence. There are pages I have never found. I think I lost myself between shifts, or someone, or something, kept me from remembering whole slabs of time. 4:13 a.m. After we put Kefir in the cooler, he wasn't there in the morning. The cooler was cold and empty, as if the night had swallowed something and then cleared its throat. Carlos insisted he woke up to a sound like the frozen drink machine being opened and closed with too much tenderness. I remember thinking at the time that the machine hum had become a clock. The town is full of people who displace blame. We call it tradition. Mororo came in a week after. She wore a scarf even in July, and had the curved, cautious smile of someone newly unmade by a community. She claimed to be a recruit of something called the mathematicists, in a tone that made it sound like a study group. The mathematicists are not in practice mathematical, as much as they are a nail-biting club of consequentialists. They decide, in small cells, what suffering must be reduced for the community to survive. A terrifying, tidy utilitarianism. They dress ideas like ethics and carry them in canvas bags. Mororo's role was ambiguous. She claimed to be trying to balance what had been damaged, and her eyes were tired like someone who had been standing under a bad fluorescent light for too long. The man in the trench coat watched her the way a hawk watches sparrows. He did not buy anything from us for months. He stood at pump number 3 and watched the road like it was a screen waiting for someone to walk through. The trench coat's collar was often up. Once he left a line of pennies in a neat arc on the counter with a note that said, "For balance." He knew how to ring up a can of mace and walk away like someone who had rehearsed leaving things. 7:12 p.m. Farmer Brown's half-pig. You have to love a town where half-truths come wrapped in BBQ sauce. Farmer Brown swore up and down his hogshed collapsed in the storm, and now he had a half-pig that walked like it was trying to remember which side it was supposed to be. He brought the half-pig to the lot and tied it to a post for a day while he sorted out the paperwork, which is when Rocco came and sniffed it and then trotted away like he'd been offended by a joke he didn't understand. Farmer Brown left and never came back. That night, gnomes were on the hood of every truck in the lot. They weren't of the cream-cheeked, harmless type. These had pale chips of paint missing like calluses. Their smiles were off, slightly too wide. Someone moved them in the middle of the night. We found them arranged in a perfect arc around the storm drain, their backs to the road like they were listening to the earth breathe. 9:01 p.m. Phone calls from dead phones. You stop returning calls after a while because the number you call only breathes back static. Someone told me it's called ghost dialing and is usually a service error. Our phones rang from numbers registered to people who stopped existing. A voicemail from Kefir, time-stamped the night we put him in the cooler, played a few seconds of someone saying, "They're digging," and then a click. Whoever is making these calls knows how the town folds. Whoever is leaving these messages is smart enough to play with fear like a child does with keys. Spencer Middleton is a man who treats violence as a tool and dulls its edges with a grin. He owns most of the muscle in town and rents the rest. He once told me, with a cigarette smouldering in the corner of his mouth, that rules were for people who needed them. He thought morally the way a man thinks when he graduates from younger sins to professional misdeeds. He had a record that sparkled unpleasantly. When he found out we had messed with Kefir, he smiled in the way someone smiles before they break something pretty. Threats are easy to make in a town like ours. It's harder to get them fulfilled. 10:38 p.m. The lawn gnomes multiplied. I half-joked the first month that the gnomes were breeding because they were bored and had nothing better to do. Then they appeared in the storage room, then inside the bathroom, and then on the low shelf by the energy drinks, as if they'd chosen brands and places to sit. You couldn't lock them up. You couldn't throw them away. We'd take them out to the road in the dead of night, set them there, and in the morning they'd be back on the counter, smiling like nothing had happened. Maroro told me once over the register that they were glyphs, simple sigils. She said it like someone describing an old menu. The handplants began as an oddity, a houseplant left in the lot, its leaves pinched to look like fingers. We laughed about it until the leaves moved like thumbs and the soil cracked like old knuckles. Then Carlos dug up a small mound that had fingers in the dirt, small as a child's, and the fingertips were smudged with what looked like ash and coffee grounds. The fingers twitched when the wind hit them, and Carlos told me he felt watched. This is the part where the town's ethics become a series of compromises that surprise no one. People who used to nod and pull at the sleeves of their jackets now kept their collars up. We traded favors for silence, a pizza for a story, a favor for a supply of cheap vodka. We numbered our secrets like we were organizing a pantry. 2:54 a.m., entry ripped out. I remember walking across the parking lot at night and feeling a small compulsion to dig. There was a strip of dirt by pump 4 that called to me like an unringing bell. Hands in the dirt for no reason. People get quirks, I told myself. Doctors call it a stress response. I called it the itch. I tried to stop. I wrote the compulsion down and stapled it to an old receipt for sunflower seeds. Later I couldn't find that page. Maybe the raccoons took it as a nesting material. Maybe I burned it. Maybe someone else read the words and decided I needed to forget. A pattern emerged. Digging, gnomes, phone calls, vanished bodies. The trenchcoat man, watching. The math-based rhetoric from a humidity-swept room where Maroro and other mathematicists discussed reductions like gardeners pruning unhealthy limbs. The more logical they sounded, the more my stomach bunched up. 33 p.m. There was a week where all the clocks stopped, not at the same time, one after the other, like dominoes. The freezer clock blinked 88:88 for 3 days. My phone lost an hour. The logbook entries started repeating themselves. Pages from the previous week reappearing in my drawer as if someone had reprinted them. I began to dream in timestamps. In those dreams, there was a door, warm to the touch, humming, and when I reached for it, I woke up with earth under my nails. I don't know when Benjamin first showed up. A man with easy hands and the build of someone who had worked with his hands a lot, he carried kindness like it was a pocket knife, useful, blunt, practical. He kept to himself, but wasn't unhelpful. He told me in the break room once that he had driven in from the highway looking for a rest stop and found us. Later, when crowns of gnomes were the talk at the diner, he said he'd seen a man with a tarp walking out to the bridge at 1 a.m. Benjamin didn't stay long in town, but when he did, something dangerous happened in a way that was less like a crime and more like a calculation. Spencer hurt a kid's dog once and then paid off the owner like a man handing over a wink. It was the kind of move that let him remind the town there's a footing beneath civil life where favors are bought with fear. I learned to avoid him when I could. He knew where I folded my guilt, and he wanted it for himself. 4:46 a.m. The back hallway had a door that nobody used. It was old and painted the color of dried citrus and leaned like it had been waiting to fall. One night, while doing inventory, I noticed warmth leaking from its seams. Warmth in a place that shouldn't have warmth. The corridor was always cold, the kind of cold that rinses your teeth with numbness. There was no reason for heat. When I pressed my palm to the knob, it vibrated under my skin. It hummed like the slushy machine, but deeper and tender like a purr. I remember thinking that if doors could cough, this one would have sneezed. I made a note. Warm door. Humming. Investigate. If not, don't. I crossed out the second clause. I don't remember who I told. I don't remember writing the line about digging. 3:58 a.m. I listened to a voicemail later that was from my own phone, and it said my name in the same tone I'd used to call myself before going in too deep. I can't say whether my voice was played back to me by something good or something clever. All I can say is that the voice sounded thirsty. When you hear your own voice saying things you haven't said, you ask yourself what you would do if someone came and stole your name. You get so tired of holding things you forget what belongs to you. There are nights I remember in fragments, like someone has cut the film into strips and scattered them around. There are nights I remember everything, with a nervous clarity, as if I were scanning newspapers for advertisements of bodies that never arrived. There are nights I woke with pockets of dirt in places I didn't think dirt could be. There are nights I woke with small, neat pebbles arranged in the palm of my hand. 10:02 p.m. Mororo stopped by the register the night the gnomes congregated behind the pump. She had a list folded into quarters and a kind of gentle authority. She told me that the mathematicists would be reducing variance, which she said aloud with such sweetness it sounded like a dessert menu. What she meant, if my worst instincts are true, is that they planned to prune events, to pick away darkness in ways that are efficient and cold. I asked her what she was planning to do about the trenchcoat man, and she smiled and said, "We'll do the math." 3:33 a.m. There are receipts where I've written, "Remember, watch for the trenchcoat." I forgot again. The trenchcoat man is a shadow you can learn to ignore until his outline begins to look familiar. He watches the pumps. He leaves the pennies. He leaves the look of a man who has stopped being surprised by anything. Sometimes, if the lights are just right, he appears in the reflection of the slushy machine behind my shoulder, like a bad memory catching up to itself. I began to tape notes to the back of slotted receipts for reasons I couldn't fully explain. If you sleep, someone will come. Don't let the gnomes in the back. Check freezer 2:30. These were rituals to keep me from blinking all the way into oblivion. They were mutters against something larger and more patient than me. One night I found a tiny hand, no larger than a walnut, buried in the grounds by pump 2. Not a child's hand, not a real hand in the way a gory film might show. It was the suggestion of a hand crafted from roots and clay, with the faint impression of sinew that looked like veins in plants. When I picked it up, it was warm as if it had been held in a pocket. Behind me, the gnomes were arranged in a smile I could not reciprocate. The night the cooler clicked open without touch, the regression began to feel immediate and personal. Items rearranged themselves between my breaks. A bag of tortilla chips would be in a different place. A handwritten note from myself would be gone. I am not a person who misplaces things. I'm a person who misplaces time. There is a line Andrew taught me in college about unreliable witnesses that I now find hilarious for how true it was. People lie because the truth is heavy. I let so many things slide that the truth sunk like a stone, and the water kept its silence. 2:01 a.m. A hole appeared behind the storage room in the dirt, like someone had pressed a thumb into a loaf of bread and then forgot to continue. It wasn't deep enough to be alarming, but it was new. The soil was warm. I poked it with a broom handle and felt something move under the dirt like a denial. I wrote the note, "Do not dig alone." I didn't follow my own rule. Someone, name scratched out, said we should plant gnomes around the hole to mark it safe. The suggestion was made with the sort of cheer you use to cover terror. More gnomes arrived in cardboard boxes like party favors. They were newer, and their faces were painted with the crispness of a factory's indifference. They lay around the hole like an audience for something that wasn't yet ready to perform. That was when the calls from dead phones started to get personal. Someone called from the number of my ex-girlfriend and told me to stop looking at the dirt. Someone called and there was music playing, old cowboy songs, and then a voice that sounded like it was chewing the air. The trenchcoat man's pennies were on the counter in the shape of a question mark. 4 a.m. I found a receipt with an itemized list that wasn't mine. Gnomes 47, hand plants 5, whole, warm, plus, singing. Someone had tallied the weird-like inventory. Someone was keeping books. I circled the line and underlined singing twice. None of us knew how to read a town where instruments were in the soil. My handwriting gets spidery when I'm nervous. It looks like someone tried to write with a twig. I've drawn arrows to things I didn't want to forget. I've written, Benjamin, help, and then scratched it out with the manners of someone too proud to beg. Pocket-sized dignity is a poor defense against the creeping of the unfamiliar. The more we covered up, the more persistent the town's appetite seemed. We found little things left in the delivery bay, a sprig of rosemary whose leaves tickled like fingers, a small pile of ash in the shape of a thumbprint, a crumpled piece of a map with a single X in the margin. These were tokens or perhaps warnings. Sometimes the tokens arrived with gloves attached or with the slight smell of someone who had been underground for too long. 10:11 p.m. It was Benjamin who found the drill marks on the door. He called me over because he thought they were new. He put his hand on the knob, and then his hand trembled like someone who was struggling against the honest thing of being afraid. The knob was warm, too warm for the back corridor, and it hummed with a low vibration I could feel in my molars. Rocco watched from the lot. He sat like a general inspecting a parade whose soldiers were invisible. We paused there. The humming was patient, like someone waiting at a restaurant who'd placed an order that seemed reasonable but was, perhaps, a mistake. I remember looking at Benjamin in a way that made him uncomfortable. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. The gnomes outside were arranged in concentric circles that made it clear they were guarding something or keeping it in. This is where the receipts stop being helpful, and memory takes over in its awkward, unreliable way. There are tapes, security footage with long stretches of static, and moments where the frame looks like a smear. There are also things people say under their breath in the break room that never make sense in the daylight. I wrote, door warm, humming, Rocco keeping watch. I drew a small gnome next to the line and shaded its eyes in with a pen so it looked like it had been woken up. I didn't open the door. The choice to not open things is still a choice. I woke the next day with the taste of copper in my mouth, and the feeling that someone had rearranged the layout of my life while I slept. The gnomes were in new positions. The trenchcoat man's pennies had formed a line from the pump to the back door. Carlos wasn't at his post. I left a note on the register. Call me when you can. At the bottom of a receipt, half covered by coffee, I wrote, they want us to count. They want us to keep books. Why are we always counting? It was a rhetorical question, and by then rhetorical questions had teeth. I haven't told you about the dark god yet. I haven't told you about the underground tree. I haven't told you about what it's like to stand in a cavern and hear a voice that knows the names of the people you tried to forget. I haven't told you how decisions look after you have seen patterns in the dirt. I'm only supposed to be writing down the receipts of things that happened. But because I keep the journal, you get the receipts. You get the smell, you get Rocco's stare, you get the gnome's smiles. You get the humming door I promised not to open. 2:02 a.m. I'm writing this now with the light of a phone and the jangle of the pump outside. There is a small scuff on the back door that wasn't there before, like fingernails trying to remember their old musical scale. I tucked the receipt into the register drawer and pushed the drawer in with my knee so I could still say it was work I was doing, and not curiosity. Sometimes the night offers you a pause that tastes like reprieve. Sometimes it offers a cliff that smells like honeysuckle ammonia and demands that you make a choice. Tonight I walked down the corridor and pressed my ear to the door. The humming was impatient, as if someone inside was aware that we were getting wise. Rocco sat on the hood of a car and looked like an animal trying to make a moral decision. I promised myself I wouldn't go further. I am terrible at keeping promises to myself. I turned the knob. The cold on the other side wasn't cold. It was like opening the fridge to find a warmth that remembered human hands. The air smelled like something between compost and lemon zest. There was, behind that door, a vibration that fit the shape of the slushy machine, and yet was full of a slow, vegetal patience. I stepped back when I heard a noise like a small, satisfied clearing of a throat. The sound was not human, and yet had the cadence of someone who missed the sarcasm of a conversation. It made the bulbs above the slushy machine hum in a new chord. I wrote the line down on a receipt the next morning. It reads in shaky letters, "Door hums, warmth spells, Rocco watchful. We should not, but they will make us." The next page is missing. The one after that is stained. The receipts stop in the middle of a sentence about someone named Benjamin, and then there is a smear that looks like someone tried to scrub away a memory. There is more. There is the smell that will not leave, and the way the gnomes look like watchful librarians. There are phone calls that know my rhythms and asks the right questions at wrong hours. There is the trenchcoat man who collects pennies, like someone making a savings for a moral bankruptcy. There is Mororo and the mathematicists who can make a spreadsheet out of grief. There is Spencer, a man whose smile is a crowbar. And there is a door humming like an animal with its own name. I turned the knob and the building pulled its breath back. Even now, the receipt in my pocket creases where I wrote the word warm. My fingers, when I rub them, retain that memory like a scar that isn't raised. The journal keeps writing me in ways I don't always authorize. It demands that I remember what I tried not to know. It tells you these things because that is how I keep the weight shifted. It also, perhaps selfishly, asks for a witness. If these are the internet's scariest tales, they are terrifying precisely because somebody somewhere is reading them and then looking over their shoulder. The night after the door hummed under my palm, Carlos came in with a bruise curling like a bruise behind his ear. He had that look men get when they have been told to hold a secret, and the secret is heavier than the thing they used to be. He sat on the stool and said, without looking up, "They dug again last night." His voice was low, as if remembering a prayer. "Who?" I asked. He tapped his temple with a finger that still trembled. "We," he said, and didn't say anything else. There are allies in ugly places. People who, when the town is tilted off its axis, take one another and try to keep the pieces from rolling into the gutters. There are also traitors, and the town is full of men who think their own survival is a neat equation to be balanced on the backs of others. I don't know yet what the door wants. I don't know if the gnomes are guardians or bait or simply an expression of cosmic whimsy. I do know that you don't get to look at a place for too long without it looking back. I closed the door for now. I locked the back gate. I told myself it was enough that I would sleep, that the journal would keep the night in the drawer where I could visit it only under the pretense of work. There are receipts that end with an ellipsis because the person writing froze. This is where my last receipt ends tonight. The door is warm, the hum has words I cannot yet pass, the gnomes have multiplied, and someone with good intentions and a pocket full of pennies is watching the road. If this is the internet's scariest tale, it's because we are really good at pretending we understand our monsters. I am not ready to tell you everything. I will tell you what I can. For now, there are footprints of raccoons in the spilled coffee, a ring of gnomes that says "do not," and a door that is breathing like it knows a secret about the ground. I slid that receipt into the drawer and shut it. The hum followed me like a question. The night hasn't answered yet. 2:17 a.m. I woke up in the break room with my palms chalky from the receipt paper. The drawer had been shut so many times, it squeaked like a tired animal. For a minute, I couldn't remember whether I'd closed it last night or the night before. The hum under the back door had gone quiet, or maybe it had merely shifted its tune into something beneath hearing. I tasted metal and lemon on my tongue like a rumour. I don't write well when I'm afraid. I write smaller things, lists, reminders, excuses. But this page is one of the longer ones, perhaps because the night had been long and because the drawer had kept coughing up receipts like it couldn't keep its secrets in. Benjamin called while I was standing behind the counter, making the coffee taste like something other than survival, and he said, "We should go down there. Tonight." He said it with the kind of quiet that made dangerous things practical. I had been trying stubbornly to avoid decisions. Avoidance is a kind of hygiene. Keep the hands clean by not touching the thing that dirties them. But you can only tidy a back room so many times before the dust decides it wants to be noticed. 10:04 p.m. We met under the leaky awning, where the rain had made tiny rivers crosswise to the neon. Benjamin brought a duffel bag that clanked with things he refused to unpack in front of me. Mororo stood near pump 3 with her scarf like a halo. Carlos arrived late, hair still smelling of cigarette smoke and whatever else kept people from sleeping. Spencer showed up like a sunless eclipse, cigarless, smelling of old leather and patience. He didn't knock. He simply waited until we all noticed him, and then made himself part of the group. "You can't do this alone," Benjamin said without looking at Spencer. "And you can't do it without something that will remind the earth it isn't the boss." Spencer smiled. "We won't be destroying the parking lot," he said. He said it like a promise. The mathematicists sent a representative, quiet, efficient Maroro, who offered equations like prayers and looked at the whole like you look at a math problem you believe you can still solve. The trenchcoat man was absent, or perhaps he watched from the lot's shadow. His pennies had multiplied into a crude road. 11:11 p.m. The gnomes were unnervingly organized. They ringed the back door now in a second, larger circle, faces all tilted toward the same center. They had collected small items, bits of string, a child's lost button, a smudged ticket that could have been a train stub. They were not the same dolls we'd once jokingly placed on customers' dashboards. Their paint had a sedimentary depth now, like layers of memory. We moved through the back like thieves, though what we took with us wasn't jewelry or money but obligation. Benjamin carried a coil of something rope-like and a bag of canned food in case the worst happens, which read to him like insurance, but to me like a hopeful child's first aid kit. Maroro brought a notebook with numbers written on the inside cover. Carlos brought a shovel. Spencer brought his fists and a temper kept warm. 11:43 p.m. Rocco watched from atop a dumpster, eyes like coin stamps. He did not approach. The raccoons never crossed the painted line the gnomes had made. Perhaps whatever governed the gnomes was more polite than whatever governed the animals. Animals here have learned politeness the way birds learn which windows are fatal. You can see it in their hesitance. We found the hatch under a loose pallet in the storage room, a square of wood rimmed in rust. The air that met us when Benjamin lifted it smelled like damp paper, lemon peel, and something green that had slept for too long. It was warm beneath our palms, a stubborn contradiction to the cold of the concrete. I remember thinking for a second that the world was being stitched incorrectly. 12:02 a.m. I don't have a neat way of putting what happened next. There is no checklist that ends in descend into cavern and make a moral decision. The receipts don't give options. We packed what felt useful, rope, a flashlight that flickered like a small conspiracy, food, an extra sweatshirt. No one set a timer. No one said a prayer everyone agreed on. We crawled down one by one like criminals and like people who still had some hope they would return before the sun remembered its job. The ladder gave a little. The shaft smelled of damp wood and turned leaves. When we dropped into the dark, it was as if we fell into a throat. Fingers of roots brushed our arms. They were dry like old paper and smelled slightly of rosemary. At the bottom, the air held a resonance. Sound traveled in a way that made shouts seem respectful and words sound like confessions. 12:23 a.m. The cavern opened up like an auditorium built around a single terrible tree. It wasn't a tree like any I'd read about. It was a topography of limbs and life, a central trunk that writhed with rings like ribs. Its bark had seam lines reminiscent of mouths. Hanging from its lower limbs were things that were once people, in the way a word is once polite. Small vegetal forms curled like infants, leaves folded to suggest eyelids, root fingers twitching as if testing salt water. The hand plants I'd been jokingly afraid of for months were here in purpose, human gestures carved in green. They did not scream when we entered. Instead, from somewhere in the rootwork, a voice that was both old and bewildered sighed out our names one by one. It had learned names by listening to us throw them away. Kefir, someone whispered, and then choked. The name tasted like a memorial. There were faces, not solid faces but impressions, an eye suggested by a knot, a mouth by a curl of lichen. Among them was a shape more human than the rest, Kefir, or what we had left of him, folded in a cradle of roots, his jaw slack, hair woven with earth. He flexed fingers that had become softer and more patient. He looked at us with a familiarity that was patient beyond cruelty. We should have left then. Any sane ledger would advise scarcity, look, acknowledge, retreat, but by the time the cavern had swallowed our trepidations, we'd already signed for complicity. 12:57 a.m. The dark god, the thing at the tree's heart, did not speak in thunder. It spoke like a neighbor who has learned that to be noticed one must be interesting. It had a voice that hummed like the back door, but was layered with accents that felt like borrowed memories. "Do you bring numbers or stories?" it asked when we were close enough to smell something like wet paper and citrus peel. Spencer wanted it to be an enemy he could beat. He stepped forward in that way men do when their fists are more honest than their thoughts. "We bring an end," he said, and his voice was the kind that tries to make violence sound tidy. Mororo interrupted. "We bring balance. We bring pruning." Her voice trembled only slightly, as if she had practiced tremors in a mirror. Benjamin looked at the tree and something softened in his face. He knelt and touched the bark, as a man might touch an old friend's elbow. "What is this?" he asked it. Not as a threat, not as a demand, but as an inquiry from someone who had seen too many things fall apart and still wished to understand. The voice, if a voice could be said to be from the heart rather than the throat, told us a history in fragments. It spoke of roots that had once curved and sheltered, of children that had sprouted from the wounds of men, of things that were planted to remember and had misunderstood the memory as life. It never used the word monster. It used the word caretaker. It said, in a phrasing that made listening feel like participating in a mistake, "They left their hands, and I kept them warm." I expected the dark god to beg or to threaten. Instead, it offered a sort of indictment that sounded like a eulogy. It suggested, without malice, that things had been traded downwards for the illusion of safety above. The hand plants, it called its children, had come to ask for recognition. They had been taken from the surface and given a new narrative. They were not monsters by origin. They were relics of neglect. 1:29 a.m. I remember the smell of rosemary and old milk and something like lemon tea when it described itself. It knew names, Kefir, Benjamin, Jack, and it spoke them as if they had been bookmarks in a book it had been rereading. There was a peculiar tenderness in the way it cited our small cruelties. It understood consequences. "Your people will not understand seeking," it said. "They will name hunger, and then be surprised it ate the table." Mororo's eyes had that dried, calculating look again. "We can prune," she whispered, thinking like a surgeon who believes mercy is necessary if it's clean. "We can cull what must be culled, reduce variance." The mathematicist's language always smelled like clean paper, and it was faintly grotesque in a place that smelled of root and damp. The tree watched as if weighing which proposal bore the lighter weight of sin. I found myself thinking of the receipts in my drawer. People had been doing the same thing down there, keeping tallies like a way to keep the sky from falling. Our numbers were always desperate. Gnomes, many. Hand plants, increasing. Bodies, misplaced. And yet the tree's argument had the soft certitude of someone who keeps a larger ledger. "Then do the math," the tree said, and its voice bent like vines. "Prune what hurts. Keep what remembers." Spencer laughed once like a coin on tile. "You want us to play God?" he snapped. It was a laugh meant to frighten, and perhaps it did frighten. There was a shudder in the rootwood. The hand plants twitched. A small cluster of them extended a leaf toward Spencer, like a child's attempt to make peace. At that, something in Benjamin hardened. He had looked so gentle an hour earlier that the shift surprised me. His patience had limits like anyone's. "We can't just have this," he said. And there it was, the practical voice that runs through tragedies and tries to boil them down to a household decision. "We can't have people disappearing. We can't have—" He searched for a word that even he couldn't stand to say aloud. I realized in the same instant that we had been bargaining with a thing that might be smarter than we were, and that in bargaining we had already admitted a level of ownership over an entity whose soil was older than our country. The moral arithmetic of the town, that you trade a favor for silence, a life for a quiet night, was small change down there. 2:03 a.m. Then Spencer moved. He intended cruelty as a tool and used it like a compass. He began telling a story of a knight and a man and a lost dog, and how punishment could instruct the town in manners. He wanted to use the whole as leverage. He imagined, with a neat certainty, a market where fear could be sold in calibrated measures. I was afraid of him then in a way that made my chest work unevenly. Fear of a man is different from fear of a place. It's more intimate. It tells you where your bones will snap if you don't move. Benjamin did something quiet. He reached into his duffel and set a small hard object on the root-matted floor. I didn't ask what it was. He called it the loud thing later, with a kind of humor that was meant to be soft but had the edge of a man who had made a decision before confessing it. Whatever it was, it had the capacity, he said, to remove the tree's voice, not to reason it away, but to break it, to make the cavern forget long enough to let us breathe. I wish I could tell you we debated with a saintly patience. We did not. We argued like people who have been keeping too many receipts and do not want to add an extra line. Some of us, Spencer most loudly, wanted to keep leverage. Maroro thought pruning could be more precise. Carlos looked at his hands and said nothing. 27 a.m. The thing in the rootwork had watched us as if it were listening to the plot of a novel. It offered no plea that made sense in the way we needed sense. It suggested, in a voice like a lullaby that had been corrupted into a ledger, "You come down to me with numbers and grief. Which will you choose to keep? Which will you let go?" Benjamin rose and placed the object against the trunk. He held it there with both hands, as if he were placing a palm on a friend's chest to feel for heartbeat. The grouse of fear in my throat sounded like a small animal. "If this ends us," I said. Too small a thing, because what I meant was, if this ends us, who will remember? Benjamin didn't answer. He already had a calm that looked like decision. There are things people do in danger, to make themselves feel less likely to freeze. Some of us hum songs, some of us tap our sleeves. I ran my fingers along the skin of my own hand to prove I existed. 2:41 a.m. Benjamin's hand closed around a small device that looked worse in close-up than it did at distance. Up close, it was just a mass of leather and metal, and a switch that said, in letters that had been worn smooth, something like, "Now." He pressed it. The cavern took a breath like a thing expecting a storm. I will not explain how the device works. I will not give you schematics. I will only tell you the sound. It was not a bang like a gun. It was the collapse of a chorus into silence. 100 tiny alarms and a single dulling thud folded together, the way a pocket folds inside a coat. The ground convulsed. Roots reared like animals and then slowed as if embarrassed. The explosion felt like being asked to remember every bad thing at once. It shoved us back toward the ladder, shoved the air through us like someone trying to scrub our lungs. Benjamin's face had an expression I will never forget, like a man who had thought about mercy and chosen a hard one. Spencer staggered, tripped over a root, and became a tangle of arms that I half feared I'd be expected to unknot. 2:43 a.m. After the sound there was a smell that tried to name itself with everything that had ever been on a summer hearth. Smoke, wet leaves, the hot metal of a car that had been too patient. The hand plants went slack as if asleep. Some of them curled inward and then did not wake up. Others shivered and then slowly rejoined the tree like fish returning to a riverbed. We climbed. The ladder had a smell of ash and lemon. My ears were ringing with the kind of sound that makes it difficult to place time. The back door had been unlatched. The gnomes outside were not as intact as they'd been. A few were broken, paint ground off like dried bones. Some lay on their fronts as if they'd been startled mid-walk. Rocco was at his usual post, eyes like coins and tail low. He sniffed at our boots, contemptuous and unaffected. 3:12 a.m. In the parking lot, the world had shifted its debts. The engine of a truck in the far corner coughed and then went quiet. The fluorescent light over pump 2 had a star-shaped fracture. A small smell of earth rose from the manhole near the storm drain. We stumbled toward the building with the awkwardness of people who have been turned inside out. The math of the town reasserted itself like gravity. Spencer began to divide ownership in his head. What of this could be sold? What could be used to keep people in line? He spoke like a broker. "We'll control the narrative," he said. "We say something came from below and cost X. We'll charge people to forget. We keep the money and the memory." His coldness was a blade he polished on the jawline of the town's unsuspecting poverty. Benjamin sat on the curb and breathed like a man who had been given a match and told to decide whether to burn down his house. His hands were dirty and unshaking. "I didn't do it to hurt them," he said, though it sounded like the kind of defense that needs to be hammered into wood to keep for later. "I did it to stop them from coming for people at night. We had curiosities left like receipts in pockets. We had burned some. We had kept others. The whole song had been interrupted. There was smoke, and in the smoke some of the more persistent compulsion receded like a tide taking its teeth back with it. For a while the gnomes were still. For a while the phone calls didn't come. 49 a.m. That period of for a while lasted 4 days. On the first morning the cooler in the storeroom had been opened, and inside was an empty, clean smell. The back of the store smelled like burnt sugar. The town came with its usual rituals, offers of prayer, offers of damage control, offers of forgetting. The sheriff called it a structural incident. The county inspector called it an electrical malfunction. The news called it small-town weirdness caught on amateur footage. Nobody, not the paper, not the policeman, not the television's voice, asked what a tree might want when it tended to the parts of people we discard. Kefir's cart was gone from the hardware store curb. His banana wax wrappings no longer warmed the hand of pigeons. People forgot in the ways people forget when the loss is inconvenient. Names became a little foggy. Some of the gnomes were nowhere to be found. Others lay on the shoulder like toys abandoned by a child in a hurry. The mathematicists published a pamphlet about communal risk reduction. Mororo spoke at a local church like a woman uncomfortable in a pulpit. "It was a responsible action," she said into a camera. Her voice had the smoothness of someone with a gift for rhetoric. I swallowed the knowledge that she had once told me she loved odd numbers because they seemed like the only things unwilling to be tamed. 4:25 a.m. Spencer predictably leveraged the town's fear. He offered protection for a fee and made men with too much time and too much cheap bravado into guards who checked trunks and followed young men home. The trenchcoat man left fewer pennies and more notes. His handwriting became a motif in the dresser drawer of local myth. He wrote things like, "Balance is a currency you can't spend," and left them taped to the store's doorframe. My compulsion to dig, the itch that had lived like a second pulse, eased. For the first week, when my fingers sought soil, I found none. I did not wake with pebbles in my palm. I did not dream of warm doors. The receipts in my drawer multiplied as if to take the place of what I would have done with my hands. I wrote more. About the night, about Rocco's silence, about how Benjamin looked after he chose the loud thing. It felt like penance, or a way of making numbers. But the town hates static equilibrium. It prefers rotations, gossip, cycles. People returned with new ways of being. New rumors have a way of planting fresh seed. 7:12 p.m. A month later, a child found a tiny thing near the storm drain. A gnome's hand, no more than a thumb, green where it had touched dirt. The parent called the store, and someone brought it in, wrapped it in napkins like a relic. They asked what it was. We shrugged. We had learned to keep our answers small and agreeable. There were nights when calls returned, but with different phrases. A teenage girl we'd known as mild-mannered woke to find she'd dialed a number she didn't know and recorded herself crying at 2 in the morning. She had, in that recording, said the names of people who had moved away. Names are the way we inventory losses. 3:05 a.m. I stopped sleeping well. You expect trauma to evaporate warnings like a damp spot on concrete. Instead, it taught me new habits. My handwriting grew smaller and more precise, as if I were trying to fit evidence into a single pocket. I found myself leaving little gifts on Benjamin's porch. A pack of batteries, a bag of coffee, a note folded like a coin. He accepted them without comment. We are complicated in our gratitude. One day the sheriff stopped by and said without malice, "Millers, good to have you back open." He had a stamp and a file and a look that said he preferred documents to stories. The town decided, in its municipal way, that the incident had been contained. Words like reset were thrown around the diner like napkins. People wanted closure. They wanted to box fear and label it as a one-off. But memory is not a jar you can label once and be done. I still kept receipts. I still had a drawer that smelled faintly of lemon and ash. I still dreamt of the tree, of faces knitted into bark, of a voice that could make caretaker sound like both apology and indictment. 9:40 p.m. The internet, of course, ate our story. Someone uploaded shaky footage of the back room. Comments poured in like rain. Some called us hoaxers. Some called us saints. Some posted patterns in the shapes of gnomes that looked like constellations. The townspeople came into the station and whispered like conspirators at a bank window. Gossip is a currency you don't easily file away. The story became part of the town's brand. We started getting late-night tourists who wanted to smell the honeysuckle ammonia for themselves. They were disappointed in the smell and delighted in the possibility of fear. It gave the gas station a kind of nasty fame. A road sign noted, "Miller's 24/7, watch your step." I found this both absurd and correct. 12:05 a.m. The handplants returned in strange ways, not as whole beings but as impressions. A sprig of rosemary that arranged itself into a fist on the counter, a potted plant that had the merest suggestion of a thumb. Old men left offerings like they were at a shrine, a bottle cap, a cigarette butt. The gnomes, when they came back, tended to be the ones with the cheeriest faces, the ones who smiled the most like someone who keeps secrets ironically. I tried to keep my voice in the journal, even as the town's appetite for the story became hungry. The receipts are the only things that make me feel honest sometimes. They keep the chronology in a pocket where it can be examined by hand like a coin. There are lines in the drawer I read and reread as if they were riddles. We thought to balance, we thought to prune, we thought we could count. I am not sure what "we" means anymore. Does it mean the mathematicists, the town, us, the people with hands in the dirt? Maybe "we" is simply the habit of trying to make numbers out of loss. 4:12 a.m. People change with the contour of crisis. Mororo moved out of town about 3 weeks after the incident. Before she left, she handed me a small folded page with numbers and wrote, "I am sorry." The mathematicist's tally was not the same as contrition. Spencer thickened into his role like a coat, his influence widening into petty vindications. Benjamin left too one night with a duffel and a promise that he would check on the road. He never came back to work. He occasionally sent postcards with pictures of places he'd found that were quieter than a town and not busy asking for bargains. Carlos called one afternoon with a voice that had been smoothed by something like regret. He told me he was leaving and that he was going to find work somewhere without big holes. He was gone in 3 days. The town turned, as towns do, and kept cursing the weather. 3:33 a.m. There are nights I believe the tree taught us something we refuse to pay for. That taking things from the ground won't stop the ground from making noise. You can remove a branch, but the ring it left stays. You can burn a paper, but the ash will remind someone of what was written. We found, months later, a receipt in the coffee tin. It was a small slip folded like a secret map, and in it I'd written in my block letters, "If they ask, say it was structural. If they prod, say you remember the hum and nothing more. Keep the drawer closed." I had taped it there like an instruction manual for cowardice. I kept it because I needed to remember that at some point we had chosen to be quiet as a tactic. I keep it because I need proof I wasn't always brave. I am not sure anyone needs that proof, but me. 5:02 p.m. Recently, young kids have started leaving new gnomes in the yard, shiny and new, as if they were inviting something back out of curiosity. The town treats them with affection, not suspicion. When someone asked me why I keep writing, I said the receipts are a way to be useful after the fact. They are my form of restitution, the small act of inventorying wrong. I was thinking the other day about how the internet loves a tidy ending. People want reset buttons and clean notes, and the sort of moral that can fit on the back of a credit card. We gave them a line they could put on a bumper sticker. Miller's, once burned, twice wise. It sold well in a weathered t-shirt. But the truth is not a t-shirt. The truth is a drawer in a counter, a smell that refuses to be branded into oblivion. The handplants are a memory that didn't get to be a person. The town is a ledger with more columns than it can reconcile and a lot of drawer room. 11:01 p.m. Sometimes, when closing the shop alone, I feel the old itch at the back of my hands. It is not as strong as it was. The compulsion pricks like the end of a forgotten string. I resist it differently now. I write instead. I fold receipts and tuck them into the drawer as if sealing small petitions. The trenchcoat man came in once, not long ago, and set a penny on the counter like a benediction. He didn't speak. He left a note that read simply, "Keep counting, but don't let numbers be your only story." His handwriting had been the same, neat, horseshoe loops. He didn't say his name, and I didn't ask it. There are things in the world that like to be anonymous. Some of them keep us from pretending. 2:14 a.m. The internet keeps collecting our echoes, people whisper. There are message boards full of assembled curios. Someone sent me a file of clips with shaky footage of the ladder. Someone else has a blog with photos of gnomes staged like an art project, with captions that read as jokes until you read them twice. I'm not above vanity. The notion that our anxiety could be traded for likes is its own kind of bitter comedy. Jerry, remember Jerry, sent me an email one morning with a subject line that read, "Want the receipts?" He runs a little corner of the internet devoted to oddities, the kind that collects things like ghost stories and roadside attractions and turns them into well-produced audio. He asked if he could use my notes as part of a series about the gas station. I said yes because I wanted someone to hold the drawer open when I was too tired to stand. You will hear in this file sometimes a different voice. That is Jerry. He edits, he compiles, he asks for permission, he curates. He is a human form of the archive, and also an annoyance because he asks for things like the dates of when Reed last came in, as if the specifics could conjure sense. Humor him. I signed the papers because I wanted the drawer to be emptied a little of its burden. 12:30 a.m. Before I handed him anything, I wrote a final receipt to tuck into the tin. The story is not done. We did something and it changed the way the world remembers. It was not a clean thing. We thought it would be neat. It wasn't. I will not pretend to have been a hero. I will not pretend to have behaved admirably. I misremember parts. I have lost sheets. The town did what towns do. We kept living in the shadow of a thing until its shadow was easier to accept. There are nights I imagine the cavern as a library and the tree as a librarian who has misunderstood the definition of catalogue. Its children were not meant to be men or monsters. They were what happens when soil keeps too many of your absences warm. I sometimes think that if you dug for the reason long enough, you would find not culpability, but neglect, small acts erected into a system that left some people to be repurposed by the dark. 3:00 a.m. If you ask me whether I regret what we did, I will not dodge. Yes, I regret. Regret is a series of small rocks in the shoe of memory, but I also sometimes imagine that if Benjamin had done nothing, more people might have gone missing. I don't know. The record is cluttered with maybes and might-have-beens. That is the ruin of being involved. You can't be sure your hand was the one to pull the lever that saved anyone or doomed them. I keep writing because a ledger in the end is the only honest way I know to say I was here. My handwriting is not heroic. It is human and scratchy and a little ashamed. The receipts are evidence that someone reached for the drawer and tried to name the night. 11:32 p.m. The town settled into a shabbier rhythm. The gnomes became a kid's game. The raccoons grew a little bolder, but they never crossed the painted line at night. People come by to fill tanks, to buy coffee, to ask if we ever found a missing dog. They ask in casual tones. They look at the counter's drawer sometimes and then they look away like someone who knows there are drawers in every life. I learn that this is a kind of mercy, the merciful forgetfulness people practice to keep themselves functioning. There are receipts I refuse to show Jerry. Certain pages I will not print because they smell too much of the raw thing. He has promised to leave those out. He doesn't press, at least not in writing. I imagine him reading the ones I do hand over late at night and smiling like an archivist with a soft tooth. He told me he wanted to produce this as part of a series called Chilling Secrets from the Gas Station. He likes the idea of a title as if it were a plaque. It's a weird vanity I allowed. I like the idea that someone will sit on a couch with headphones and listen to my voice and the roar of our little world. We think we will be redeemed by attention. 12:05 a.m. The last receipt I will tuck here tonight is small and practical, as if I plan to make the mundane stand in for courage. On it I wrote, "If asked, say Kefir's cart is gone because people remembered him kindly. Say that Benjamin left town for work. Say Mororo kept studying. Say that Spencer is doing what he always does, consolidating fear into profit. Say that I keep writing because I don't trust myself to stop otherwise. The drawer is heavier for being full. Maybe that's how you measure safety, not by the lack of bad things, but by how full the pockets of memory are. I keep the hum as a memory in the pulp of my pen. It vibrates like the small note of a machine that remembers how to sing. If someone asked me whether the dark god was a monster or a guardian, I'll probably answer in the way people answer hard questions, with another question. Which of us would you like to be? The one who pruned with detachment, or the one who learned to keep hands warm? You will choose perhaps as your ethics demand. 2:08 a.m. For now the lot glows under its neon like a false dawn. Rocco sleeps on the car hood. The gnomes rearrange themselves like a child's trick of hiding spoons. The drawer is closed. The cogs of the town mesh again. The story is packaged for the internet, and for people who need their frissons. These are receipts from a place that will not be tidy. I keep them because they anchor me in a truth that is messy. One last thing before I fold the page and slide it into the drawer. The dark god spoke in the cavern. A line that has rung in my ear ever since. It was not a threat, and it was not comfort. It was like a teacher admitting a hard lesson. You plant hands to remember, it said. You call the world safe, and then you are surprised that the earth keeps score. It phrased the accusation not to punish, but to observe, like someone who has worked too long with accounts. We left the cavern with something missing and something gained. We have receipts for both. If you are still listening, if you have read this far, then you have entered into my witness. That is both burden and mercy. I am handing these receipts to someone who wanted to curate them for others. I am, in a sense, inviting the internet to keep count with me. There will be more stories. There always are. The town likes to tell itself stories to sleep. If you want the next part of the tales from the gas station, if you want to follow where the rest of the drawer goes, check the links in the description and follow the collaborators. Jerry will tidy things into a sequence that sounds better than my handwriting. He will add music and 2 different voices and the hum of a slushy machine somewhere for atmosphere. He will perhaps make monsters out of minutes. He will remind you that a lot of horror is about being awake when everyone else is asleep. For the record, for the receipts, for the smells that do not leave even after you wash your hands, thank you for listening. For the people who helped, who came down, who left, this is where I leave my last inventory for tonight. Credits: Jerry for collecting, Mororo for numbers and for leaving the note, Benjamin for making the hard choice, Carlos for the shovel he never meant to use, Spencer for being himself, Rocco for not speaking, and to the many anonymous people who left gnomes on our curb and taught us how to count. If you hear a slushy hum at 2 in the morning when you're meant to be sleeping, do a small thing for someone else. Hand them a receipt. Let them keep the story if they need it. I will close the drawer now. The light above the register blinks in its steady, fluorescent way. The night is patient. The receipts are patient. I am tired and still curious. That, I think, might be the worst combination for anyone who works late hours with a drawer full of memories. Jack.